There's a fly flying around. I hope you guys can't hear it. It's pretty annoying. Okay, anyway. Do you want to use somebody else's music, photos, video clips in, let's say, your YouTube channel, a podcast, blog, or other content, but you're worried about, I don't know, maybe getting a copyright strike from YouTube, having your account suspended or completely removed, or worse, getting an actual legal trouble, like an actual lawsuit against you? Then keep watching, because we're gonna break down fair use and how you can use somebody else's copyrighted works in your YouTube videos, podcasts, blogs, websites, other content without getting into legal trouble. Hi everyone, I'm attorney Aiden Durham with 180 Law Co. in Colorado, and welcome back to All Up in Your Business. I've made a few videos where I talk about copyrights. I did one recently about legal issues that have to do with launching a podcast, and I've talked about copyrights quite a bit. In those videos, I usually briefly mention fair use, because fair use is a legitimate way to use the work of somebody else in your content. But I've never really gone into a lot of detail about it because, quite frankly, it's pretty complicated. But that's exactly what we're gonna do today. I'm gonna give you guys a breakdown of what fair use is and how it works, and how you might be able to use fair use for yourself to avoid potential copyright infringement or copyright strikes with your content. Before we get into all that, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share, and check the description for links to additional information and resources. All right, so just a little bit of basics. When it comes to copyright law, if you want to use the work of somebody else, whether it be a photo, a video clip of a movie, a portion of a song, if you want to use somebody else's work, you need authorization to do it. In most instances, that authorization comes in the form of a license. We might purchase a license to use a photo on a website, or purchase a license to use a portion of a song or an entire song, or we might have a license under Creative Commons. But what if a license isn't available? What if you want to use something and there's no way to get a license? Maybe you reach out to the owner or the creator of the work, you don't hear anything back. Can you still use that stuff? Of course, it depends, and that's where fair use comes into play. Federal law, the Copyright Act of 1976, it grants a bunch of rights to copyright holders, the creators or authors or owners of copyright in a work. But those rights come with some limitations, and the fair use doctrine is one of those limitations. It's really one of the most significant ways that we can be permitted to use copyrighted works of somebody else without a license or actual authorization to do so. But the difficult part is that these laws don't really give us specific criteria of what is and isn't considered fair use. Instead, it just kind of gives us some guidelines to go off of. I think it helps to understand the purpose of fair use, why it exists in the first place. The primary rationale behind the fair use doctrine has to do with kind of advancing society's interests in arts and creativity while still preserving the rights of a copyright holder. And so that's kind of what fair use is based off of. So this law, the Copyright Act, it gives us kind of a list of situations or purposes where something might be considered fair use. Things like criticism, commentary, news reporting, teaching, research, scholarship. When used in those contexts, fair use might apply. That's not an exhaustive list of situations where we see fair use, but those are really kind of the more common ones and the ones that are specifically stated in that law. There are also a handful of factors that a court will use to determine if use is considered fair use. Those are the purpose and character of the use, the nature of the copyrighted work, how much of the work is used, and the overall effect that that use might have on the marketplace or value of the copyrighted work. Don't worry, if that all sounds a little confusing, I'm about to get more into it. So when it comes to that first factor, purpose and character of the use, there are two things that we're going to want to ask ourselves. Number one is whether this use is of commercial use or whether it's transformative use. So non-commercial uses are typically going to weigh more likely in favor of fair use versus commercial use. Now, that's not to say that just because you're using something in a commercial way that it's not fair use, but if it's non-commercial, then the likelihood that it would be fair use is a little bit higher. But then of course the question comes up, what does commercial use mean? Basically it comes down to if you're profiting off of it in some way, then it's considered commercial. It doesn't have to involve a direct financial gain. It might be considered commercial use just because it makes it so that other people don't have to actually purchase the original work. If they see your work using that original work and no longer need to purchase the original work, then that might mean it's a commercial use. Same goes for if it's intended to induce someone to purchase something else. So if there's some gain, some profit from it, or if it would cause people to no longer seek out that original work, then it's most likely going to be considered commercial use. And if it's a commercial use, then that might lend itself to being not fair use. Now again, this is just one factor. Even if it is commercial use, it could still be considered fair use, depending on, of course, all the other factors. The other relevant question is whether the use is transformative. Again, what does transformative mean? We generally consider it to be transformative if it adds something new to the copyrighted original work, or if it has a different function or character or purpose than the original work did. So using somebody else's copyrighted work might be considered transformative and therefore fair use if it modifies the work itself or if it uses it in a different context, like for commentary or parody, or again, if it has a different purpose or function than the original work. And the more transformative it is, then the more likely it would be considered fair use. There are a couple of really interesting cases, all stemming from the same person actually, that kind of help to demonstrate what transformative and not transformative use looks like. In 2006, a person named Koons, an artist, used a black and white photo of another photographer to create a sculpture of that photograph. The sculpture was in color, whereas the photo was black and white, and there were some minor alterations to the sculpture as it relates to the photo. So basically this person was creating this photo, but in sculpture form with a couple different tweaks. What do you guys think? Do you think that's transformative? Is that considered fair use? Well, the court did not think so. They said that turning this photo into a three-dimensional sculpture isn't considered fair use. Even though the artist, Koons, he also said that there was some parody or commentary behind it too, but still that wasn't good enough. In that case, the court told us that this new work, the new purpose of it wasn't sufficiently evident, and it was unclear that a new creative work had been produced. But then a few years later, that same artist, Koons, he created a painting that included the legs and feet of different people, including a pair of legs and feet that were cropped out from somebody else's photograph. How about this? Do we think that's transformative and fair use? Well, the court thought so too. Yep, they said that using that portion of the photograph was transformative enough. The original photo had been used for like a cosmetics ad, something like that, something in a lifestyle fashion magazine. And the purpose of that original work was to demonstrate the like metallic cosmetics of this company. Whereas the artist who created the new work, Koons, that new work only used a portion of the photo, the legs and feet, and it showed the image in an entirely different context than how it was originally. The court also saw it as kind of a commentary on society. So that's a good example of how fair use isn't an easy thing to determine if it applies. So that covers the purpose and character of the use. Now let's get into the nature of the copyrighted work itself, which is the second factor that a court will look at. So the nature of the copyrighted work, this looks into whether the original work is creative versus factual or published versus unpublished. So instead of focusing on the new work, we're thinking about the original work. The more creative a work is versus maybe being factual, if it's more creative, then the copyright protections might be a bit stronger. Whereas if it's more of a factual work, copyright isn't necessarily trying to protect ideas. Copyrights protect creative expression. So if there's limited creativity in the original work, then the copyright protection is going to be a little limited. And then published versus unpublished, the thought here is that if the author, the creator of the original work, has already published the work, put it out there, then they're already wanting to exploit it to an extent for commercial purposes. And so it's more likely with a published work that it would lean towards fair use versus an unpublished work, which by its nature, if the creator or author didn't publish it, they might not have wanted it out there. And so if we're using it now in our own creation or in our own content, then that may not be fair use. But again, just because it's already been published doesn't mean it's automatically fair use. And on the flip side, just because it's unpublished, that alone doesn't mean it's not fair use. Again, it's just one factor that they might take into account. The third factor that we want to focus on is the amount or substantiality of the portion of the work that was used. Now, I think this is where the whole idea of you can use a certain amount, a certain time limit of like a song or a movie without copyright issues. For the record, that's not really a thing. There's no set rule that says you can use 3 seconds of a song or you can use 10 seconds of a movie and it's not copyright infringement or it's considered fair use. That doesn't exist. But that concept of how much of the work we're using is a real thing. The biggest part of it, though, is using only as much as necessary. So let's say we're trying to follow fair use. We want to make sure we're doing commentary or criticism or parody. Let's say I'm making a parody video of, I don't know, something on TV. I want to do a parody of some show. And in that, I'm going to use a clip of the show. That doesn't mean I can just use the entire episode of the show. Fair use is only going to apply if I'm using only as much as I need to get my point across or to get that parody across. So it's not a blanket of if I'm making some kind of parody or commentary or news reporting video, I can use whatever content I want to. I can only use as much as I need to or reasonably should use for my new work. And this is going to take into account the quantity of the work that you're using as well as the quality of the work. So let's say we're going to use 10 seconds of a movie in our YouTube video. We're going to comment on it or do a reaction or something. We're going to use 10 seconds of a movie. All right, 10 seconds, that might be okay. But if that 10 seconds is a clip of the climax of the movie, if it's the Shyamalan twist that we're using and we're giving that away, that portion that we're using may not be considered a reasonable use and qualify under the fair use doctrine. Because to an extent, now we're kind of competing with the movie itself. If we're giving away the big reveal or giving away the main point of this movie, that's an inappropriate use of the heart of the work. On the flip side though, let's say we want to crop out some portion of a photo that somebody else has taken. If we're cropping out some very random portion of that photo that's totally out of context of the giant overall photo, that might be fair use. Let's say it's a portrait of somebody standing in the woods and We take a cropping of a tree in the background. The original work's main purpose didn't have anything to do with that tree. It was probably the person whose portrait is in it. And so the fact that we're taking this kind of minor aspect of the photo and using it in our own work, that might go towards fair use. And then lastly, we're going to focus on the effect that this might have on the market for that original work. If we're producing something that incorporates the work of somebody else, and by doing so, people might buy our thing instead of that original thing, that's not going to be in our favor when it comes to fair use. If it's going to harm the original creator or take away potential profits from the original creator, fair use doesn't want to allow us to do that. Of course, it's always best to play on the safe side and get a license, get actual authorization whenever you can, because relying on fair use can be kind of dangerous because we never really know for sure. The only way to know for sure if we're allowed to use this work in a YouTube video, in a podcast, in a movie, in a book, in anything, is with actual authorization. Fair use, in my opinion, should be kind of a default if that license or that actual authorization isn't an option. And for what it's worth, because this question came up from one of my clients and I thought it was really interesting. If we ask for a license and the person tells us no, or maybe doesn't respond, but we think it's fair use, the fact that we asked for that permission or that license and didn't get it, that isn't going to damage a potential argument of fair use. So if we think it might be fair use, but we want to just play it safe, but we don't get that license, we could still rely on fair use without the fact that we were denied affecting our ability to assert fair use. So when it comes to fair use, again, I mean, as you can tell, it's pretty complicated. The main things that we want to focus on are how we're using the work. If we're doing commentary or news reporting or educational, those situations are more likely to be in fair use, assuming the other factors are in line with it too. If we're not giving away the heart of the work, if we're not using the entire work versus, maybe just a little portion of it. All of these different things are going to come into play. Now, I know this may not be as practically helpful as some of you are hoping for. I'm not telling you, here's what you need to do. I like to give you guys kind of a general understanding of how these things work. But if you want more of a how-to fair use, I suggest checking out Ian Corzine's videos. I'll link to a few of them in the description. He creates a lot of content about fair use, copyright on YouTube, YouTube strikes, all that stuff, and he does a really good job of breaking down more of the how-to of fair use. So I suggest checking him out. That's all for this episode, folks. Drop a comment below, let me know what you think. And again, don't forget to check the description for links to additional information and resources. Thank you all so much for watching. I'm Aiden Durham, and I'll see you next time.